Good morning, it's Luke Alagenis here from the Fraud Control section of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm here with my colleagues and Helen, and we're here to talk about DFAT's fraud control procedures, fraud control and anti-corruption procedures. If you have any questions, please send them through and we'll endeavour to answer them as we go. I do have a question that was sent before the session, and I'll perhaps answer that at the end when we've gone through some of the substance of some of DFAT's procedures. So, our learning journey this morning will look at identifying fraud, what constitutes fraud. We'll then look at what the reporting requirements are around that fraud, and finally, very importantly, managing and finalising those fraud cases to bring them to a timely closure. Okay, so what is fraud and corruption? The definition of fraud is dishonestly obtaining a benefit or causing a loss by deception or other means. And that definition is taken from the Commonwealth Fraud Control Framework, the definition that the Department uses. There's two things to note about that definition. Firstly, there's an element of intent there. So there's an element of intent, so someone has to be intending to commit fraud. So what that means is that merely non-compliance with policy is not on its own fraud, as long as there's not the intent. Also, inefficient or ineffective management practices also will not be fraud, as long as there's not the element of intent there. So there's a couple of things there that are not fraud. The question of it, the element of intent is missing. The other thing to note about the definition is that it's a very, very broad definition, intentionally so. So it captures many, many different things. It's a very broad definition. That's the commonly accepted and used definition of fraud. Corruption, on the other hand, it doesn't have the same generally agreed definition. For our purposes, we treat it as the abuse of entrusted power or entrusted office. And certainly from the fraud control section's perspective, we refer to fraud and corruption almost interchangeably, so we treat them in the same manner. So how does fraud come about? How does it arise? Practitioners often talk about something referred to as the fraud triangle, which is a conceptual model which attempts to conceptualise how fraud can come about. And the model was developed by an American academic back in the 50s, criminologist working on a PhD, I understand. And the model basically says that initially there's some sort of pressure that operates on the individual, the suspect or the offender, and that pressure can come from many, many different sources. It can be to do with gambling addiction or substance addiction of some type. It can be to do with financial pressures caused by debts or a lavish lifestyle. In places in Asia and the Pacific also there could be cultural elements. If anyone's familiar with the Pacific, for instance, there's pressures from the Wontok system where the systems of kinship create obligations on individuals. So the model says that there is some form of pressure operating on the individual. Then there's a process of rationalisation in the mind of the individual, and that rationalisation can take many forms. Things like, for instance, I work very hard, I'm not paid enough for what I do, nobody appreciates what I do, or possibly one we hear is that I'm only borrowing these funds, so I'm going to return them. So that's often a rationalisation. And then if you have the pressure and the rationalisation, and then if the opportunity presents itself, and that opportunity is through the lack of a robust internal control system, if that opportunity presents itself, then fraud can occur. So that's the conceptual model. So as we said in the previous slide, the key importance of internal controls, and these are just some of the internal controls that we would expect any good organisation to have. Things from at the top there, the ethical culture of the organisation, the tone that management sets. So if management has a very strict attitude to fraud prevention or a very lax attitude to fraud prevention, that generally tends to filter down and flow through the organisation. So the ethical culture that the organisation has is a soft control. Then things like policies and procedures and guidance materials. So staff working at the organisation know what they have guidance. They know what the expectations are of the organisation, and these can be the key policies in terms of conflicts of interest might be one, acceptance of gifts and hospitality might be others, but also more routine processes and policies, documented procedures and documented guidelines around, for example, HR, recruitment, procurement exercises. What are the rules? What are the procedures that need to be followed? What we're doing this morning, fraud awareness training, that's also a key feature there in terms of prevention and having good, strong internal controls, and a range of other things there. Towards the middle of the list, you'll see my personal favourite, the segregation of incompatible duties. As a former auditor, that's one that's very, very dear to my heart. What that really means in simple terms is that no one individual should have duties that allow them to circumvent the control system. So, for example, it would not be a good idea to say to the one person, you can be responsible for ordering goods, you can be responsible for certifying that they've been received, certifying the invoice for payment, and for good measure we'll also make you responsible for undertaking the bank reconciliation. Obviously that's not a good scenario, because that one individual then have too much power and could undertake whatever they wish basically and cover their tracks. So we need to segregate out those different duties. Ideally each one of those processes should be allocated to a separate individual, but quite often in small organisations that may not be possible, but to the degree it is possible we need to segregate those incompatible duties. That's why we often have two counter-signatories on a cheque or someone reviewing someone else's work. That's the same idea there. And then running through the list, undertaking site visits, inspections to confirm work has been completed to a satisfactory standard. And finally there's a range of internal audits, due diligence reviews that are undertaken. The department's internal audit area does undertake audits and reviews of partner organisations. So they're just some of the key controls that any good organisation should have. So the previous slide was prevention. Now with detection, we have what we call red flags. What we mean by the term red flags is these are early warning signs of potential fraud. So on their own, they're not necessarily definitive, and they don't mean that fraud is necessarily occurring, but they're alarm bells. They merit further scrutiny and attention. And these are broken up into three categories there. So first one is organisational. Well, what we mean by that is simply the list of the key controls we had on the previous slide. In the absence of that, where we have weak internal controls, that would be a red flag. The next group is statistical, and this is where numbers stand out as being strange or unusual in some regard. For instance, if we know that there's a particular threshold at which a transaction will be subject to further scrutiny, having a pattern of payments that's continually coming just under that threshold to avoid scrutiny, that might be something that would merit looking into. For example, if we know that every payment over $1,000, say, is subject to a certain more scrutiny, if that payment continually comes in month after month at $999, that might be an alarm bell that someone would need to look into to perhaps pay closer attention. Also, where there are patterns, and then in 1 month there might be something that deviates from what we'd expect, that would again be something that would be a statistical red flag. So anything that's strange or unusual, abnormally large perhaps. And the final category there is what we call behavioural. So this is where people are behaving in an odd way, perhaps a change in the way they behave. People are being perhaps secretive about their work, working late at night on their own, very defensive when people ask them what they're doing, failure to take leave for fear of somebody else doing their job and detecting something. So all these are what we refer to as red flags. As I say, on their own, they don't necessarily prove that fraud is occurring, but they should give us cause for concern of perhaps merit looking into matters more deeply. Some of the common types of fraud that we encounter. Firstly, the falsifying or doctoring of receipts. This is quite a common one that we can see, perhaps in an acquittal process. That might be common. The next two, in terms of procurement, where we're invoicing for goods or services that are either not delivered or under-delivered, or similarly billing for a certain quality or standard of product and then delivering another lower quality. Finally, there in the area of scholarships, it might be forged or altered documents, or indeed failing to declare a condition that would make someone ineligible. So these are just some of the common types of fraud we see. There are many, many others. The next few slides deal with specific areas. The first one I'd like to draw to your attention is bribery of foreign officials. And the important thing to note here, of course, is that it's a criminal offence in Australia, and this offence has what we call extraterritorial application. What that means is that an Australian company or an Australian citizen or resident can be prosecuted in Australia even if the offence or alleged offence has occurred overseas. So it has extraterritorial application. And these incidents, the way we treat them at DFAT is we have a specific section, the transnational crime section. They're reported to that section, and that section is responsible to then relay those to the Australian Federal Police, which has the responsibility for Australian extraterritorial offences, including bribery. The reason that we're telling you this is not that we suspect you're that you're bribing foreign officials, but it's conceivable that you may become aware of cases of this, or perhaps allegations of this, and the requirement is that you report that. And as I say, if you can report that to the fraud control section, we will take it further then and through our transnational crime section. The next specific case we're looking at is facilitation payments. And these are payments that are made outside the normal business process, so they're outside normal terms of contracts and agreements. They're usually secretive in nature, so they're not widely communicated, and they're usually payments that are made to individuals rather than organisations. And the difference between bribery and the facilitation payment, bribery is when we're paying an official to do something that they shouldn't be doing, whereas the facilitation payment is paying an official to do something that they should be doing, but for whatever reason they've chosen not to do. So the key point here is that facilitation payments are against DFAT policy. So we've taken the position that it's very difficult often to differentiate between what is simply a facilitation payment and what is bribery. Facilitation payments are inherently murky in their nature, and because of that, we don't wish to be involved in that. So we've taken the policy position that facilitation payments, we don't undertake them, and we don't use Australian aid funding to undertake them either. So they're completely ruled out from a policy perspective. Next we have conflict of interest. Some of you may be familiar with this idea. What we mean by a conflict of interest is where someone's personal or private interests may be in conflict or potential conflict with their official duties or functions. The key thing to note here is that these conflicts can be real or they can be perceived. Quite often the perception of a conflict can be just as damaging as the actuality of conflict. And they can be financial or non-financial in nature. And common examples we see there is in the case of a financial conflict, maybe where someone owns shares in, say, a particular company, which is tendering on the project, and you happen to have responsibility for that tender. So that would be a clear financial conflict of interest. Common non-financial example may be where there's some sort of recruitment process and there's a direct hiring of a relative or a friend in the absence of a merit-based competitive selection process. But the key things with conflicts, again, any good organisation should have documented policies for their staff to guide them, to set out what is acceptable and unacceptable, and to provide that guidance. Certainly, a good organisation should have a policy that says that staff should avoid those conflicts where possible. If that's not possible, then they certainly need to be disclosed and managed as instructed. and so you would report those to your supervisor or manager, and then they will need to be managed in accordance with those instructions from your supervisor or manager. The key message there is that it's not an area where you can choose to self-manage. Obviously, if you have a conflict or a potential conflict, then you're not in a position to act impartially or objectively. So you need to act on those as instructed once you've reported them to your supervisor or manager. If we now look at the expectations and the requirements for DFAT's implementing partners, including NGOs, the key thing to note there is that we expect everyone to act with the highest ethical standards, and that's embodied in the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct and provisions which relate to fraud control and conflicts, and this is through a contractual obligation. So the first thing to note is that all parties must act with the highest ethical standards. The next item, very importantly from our perspective at the fraud control section in DFAT, is that there's a requirement to report to us within 5 working days. So that's all cases that are suspected or allegations of fraud or corruption need to be reported to the fraud control section within 5 working days. We understand that quite often that people will have their own contacts within, say, DFAT. They may feel more comfortable to speak to their contacts first. That's perfectly acceptable, but we ask that that needs to be reported to the fraud control section within 5 working days. There is a specific form that we will ask that you use. It's the What to Report form. It provides very detailed information regarding the circumstances of the allegation or the event, and it allows us to focus on how we can investigate those matters. Obviously, you would appreciate that it's almost impossible to investigate a broad general allegation. We need details and specifics. The What to Report form serves that purpose. Also, there's a requirement to develop and implement a strategy to investigate any instances that are highlighted, and we do that in consultation. You will do that in consultation with DFAT, and together we will develop a plan to investigate. And just to highlight, there is also a contractual, DFAT has the contractual right to terminate a contract or to not enter into future contracts if we find out that people haven't been reporting this fraud allegations or incidents of fraud. It will never be the case that we will ever say to anyone, you're reporting too much fraud. We ask that you report not only proven cases of fraud, in fact we ask that you report suspicions or allegations of fraud. We understand that will often mean that you may not have the details, because quite often, particularly in the early stages, things are still murky, unclear, but we need as many details as they come to light, and we will certainly ask that you report any allegations and suspicions of fraud, and we'll decide what to do with those matters going forward. So the reporting, as I said, needs to be very prompt. Ideally, the What to Report form should be completed, but it's really the substance of the matters and the allegations that we're interested in. Happy to talk to people, but ultimately we will require everything in writing, and we have there, you can see the fraud inbox, our fraud@dfat.gov.au. And also for ANCP matters, we ask that you CC DFAT ANCP as well at the email address shown there, ANCP. In reporting to us, we seek to apply Australian standards wherever possible, even overseas, and we follow the Australian rules of evidence where we can. So we ask that whilst you certainly make any notes of suspicious activity or things that you've witnessed or obtained, documents you may have obtained legally, we certainly ask you to resist the temptation to break into people's lockers or lock cabinets, etc. Because in the Australian system, this taints any evidence or documents obtained in that way. And as I said, we seek to apply Australian norms wherever we can. There's also a requirement in reporting to maintain confidentiality of matters at all times. And this is both the confidentiality of people that may be making allegations, and also the people against whom those allegations are made. So we're dealing with very serious matters here. Obviously they're sensitive, so they're not the sort of things that we discuss broadly. They're not the sort of things that we have chats about around over coffee or around the office call, water cooler, etc. These are issues that are very serious and dealing with people's lives. You need to maintain, only refer that matter to individuals that actually need to know. So confidentiality, very, very important. Report it to your direct supervisor or to your manager. So who should you be telling? Basically, it's anyone who has a strict need to know. So it doesn't go beyond that. There is something in the Commonwealth referred to as the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which encourages individuals to come forward and, if they have information of wrongdoing, encourages individuals to come forward, referred to as whistleblowing, and the Act actually attempts to protect those people by keeping their identity confidential. And it also requires agencies, including DFAT, to take action and look at those matters and treat them seriously, which we do. So, as I say, confidentiality very important, and should only be referring these matters to people who have a direct need to know, not more widely. In Australia, we have, I said, we need to protect not only the identity of the person who's making the allegation, but also against the person against whom those allegations may be made. And this is because in Australia we have what we call the presumption of innocence. Other countries overseas may have different legal systems, but in Australia we have the presumption of innocence, which means that someone is presumed to be innocent until such time as they're proven otherwise. It's important to maintain confidentiality of all parties at all times. So in terms of the substance and the heart of how DFAT treats suspicions or allegations of fraud and corruption, we have what's referred to as the zero tolerance approach. So this is the principle that we will seek to apply in all cases. And what does that actually mean? So when we say zero tolerance approach, what DFAT means by that is that where there is an attempt or an allegation or a suspicion of fraud, that we require an investigation to be undertaken of all matters reported. So that investigation is to determine firstly whether the fraud has indeed occurred, and if it has, to determine the nature and extent of that fraud. Where the fraud has occurred, there's elements that we need to work through in terms of the zero tolerance elements. So firstly, that we seek to apply any administrative or contractual penalties, and we'll look at each of these in turn shortly, but that generally means termination. There are other possibilities, but generally that means termination. We also seek the prosecution of offenders where an offender may have been identified, including by referring matters to police authorities or other local authorities overseas as might be appropriate, and indeed in Australia with the AFP if that's appropriate. And in all cases we also seek the recovery of fraud losses, so misappropriated funds or assets, so we seek the recovery through whatever means we can. So that's the zero tolerance approach. The final requirement is that we also expect that controls will be strengthened or new measures will be put in place in order to prevent a similar occurrence in the future. So we like to see that controls have been beefed up to make sure that this sort of thing can't be allowed to happen again. So that's the zero tolerance approach. We did have one question that was submitted before this morning, and someone asked about what's the appetite of DFAT for fraud in terms of the requirement to investigate all matters, even perhaps low dollar value. Well, the answer to that question is that the zero tolerance approach applies equally to all matters, irrespective of their financial value. So we have cases on our books which have a relatively minor financial value, and we have cases on our books which have quite a significant financial value. But the zero tolerance approach is applied equally to all, irrespective of the financial value. So we need to investigate and look at those matters for all cases. The financial value doesn't come into it. Obviously, part of the reason for that is that we want our policies to have a deterrent value, so people know that we're serious about fraud, but also more importantly, when we're dealing with public funding and funding from the Australian taxpayer. We need to maintain the goodwill of the donors and indeed the Australian taxpayer. So taxpayers need to know that we're looking at all fraud matters seriously and pursuing them as much as possible. So the zero tolerance approach applies to all cases, irrespective of the financial value. So under the zero tolerance, we said that all matters need to be investigated to determine the nature and extent of the fraud, to confirm if fraud has occurred and determine its nature and extent if it has occurred. And together we'll develop an investigation plan. So in consultation with the fraud control section, we'll develop a plan as to how that matter will be investigated, and this can involve terms of reference for investigations or auditors, and we can assist with that process. The type of investigation that will be involved, there are a range of possibilities. At one end we have a simple audit, which is a sampling process, ranging right through to a forensic audit, which is a check with an investigation process which follows every payment through from beginning to end, and somewhere in the middle there we also have an investigation which can be tailored specifically to the circumstances. A forensic audit would perhaps be used where there is an expectation at the outset that we're going to lead to a prosecution or legal matters, a legal process. But initially, I think it's fair to say that in practice, most investigations will probably start off at least with an audit, and then depending on the outcome of that audit, they may progress to a forensic audit or a more detailed investigation. There are a number of avenues, but whatever avenue we take, the investigation needs to be undertaken in a timely way and a proactive way, whether that investigation is conducted internally by auditors or an external investigator. And the reason for that is that the outcome is that we usually find that the longer things are allowed to languish and to continue on, that it usually has a bad outcome in terms and as you can appreciate, people move on, documents get lost, people's memories get hazy, so the longer things are left, usually less likely that we have a good outcome from a fraud management perspective. So it's very key that we have a proactive and timely management of those cases and investigations. As we said, once we've established the investigation established that fraud has occurred, we need to work through the zero tolerance elements. And the first one of those is the application of administrative or any contractual penalties that may apply. And there's a range of different things there. As I said, usually it's the termination of employment or a contract, but there could be some sort of disciplinary action or suspension or a range of other things there. Usually it's termination. Also, we seek prosecution of offenders if they're identified, as I said, and we do that by reporting. We can do that through reporting to local police authorities or other authorities, as might be appropriate overseas. Not always is it appropriate to report to police in certain jurisdictions. There may be other local authorities, but whatever those processes are, we seek to report those to those authorities. And we ask that this be reported initially to those authorities, and we require that there be at least one follow-up within a 6-month report period of the initial report. Now, we understand also that in certain cases that may not be appropriate, and the policy allows for exemption. And the exemption is on the grounds of exceptional circumstances, which in practice tends to mean a risk to the life or safety of someone, whether it's an informant or a staff member. So if there is a risk to the life or safety of someone, then that can be grounds for exemption. Seeking that exemption, the person the delegate who has got the authority to grant that exemption is the director of the section that I work for, the fraud control section, and only that individual can grant an exemption. So if you believe there are grounds for an exemption, then you need to make that case, and that case will be decided upon by the delegate, who may grant the exemption if they agree with those circumstances. The other element of zero tolerance is recovery of any misappropriated funds or assets. So we seek in all cases to recover fully and through whatever avenue might be open to us, whether that's through partners or the offender themselves, insurance, whatever means possible, we will seek to make full recovery. But again, the policy recognises that in not all cases will recovery be possible, and there are grounds where non-recovery can be approved. The delegation for that, because it is in fact a financial delegation, rests with someone who has that appropriate delegation within the. Again, we ask if, and those grounds for that are set out in the Commonwealth Financial Management Framework, and the grounds are where it's uneconomical to pursue further recovery, or there's no legal debt to the Commonwealth. So again, if you believe that to be the case, you need to set that case out, forward that to the fraud control section, and we'll see that it goes to the appropriate financial delegate to approve that if that's appropriate. Okay, so we've gone through the zero tolerance elements, and that brings us round to closing cases. The only way we can close a case is where all elements of the zero tolerance approach have been satisfied. The only person who can close a case is the appropriate delegate, which is the director of the fraud control section. So if you believe that the case has been managed and all the elements of zero tolerance have been met, then you can make a recommendation that the case be closed. That will then go to the delegate, and they will either agree or disagree to close that case. So that's the appropriate individual who holds that delegation. So that's really the end of our presentation this morning. Just to summarise the key points of what we've covered this morning. Firstly, the importance of reporting promptly to the fraud control section, and this covers, as I say, not just cases of proven fraud, but any allegations or suspicions of fraud. So we ask that you report those as well, and that's with that you're required to do that within 5 working days to the fraud control section. So if you need to report in the interim to head office or someone else, that's fine. But that report needs to make its way to the fraud control section within 5 weeks. Together we'll develop an investigation plan, and we seek to proactively manage those cases. As part of that process, we find that it's, on a practical level, very, very useful to have a good record-keeping system. And this goes to the nature of evidence. Quite often there might be an allegation or a suspicion of fraud, but if we can't prove that, quite often we can't prove that because there is insufficient evidence. As I say, records or documents may go missing, so it's very important to be able to find documents when you want them and find them quickly. So that's the importance of a good record-keeping system. If you're managing contracts, then obviously it's very key to have a good understanding of the obligations and duties of each of the parties in relation to those contracts, and to reinforce those contract provisions. If we're also have involved investigation, there may be audit reports or other investigation reports, then we need to digest those reports and take the appropriate action. So what were the findings of those reports? What were the findings of the audit? What were the recommendations of the audit? And what do those findings and recommendations mean for our audit investigation? Our fraud investigation, and in terms of forming the next steps that we need to undertake in terms of the investigation. So it's not just a matter of commissioning an audit or commissioning an investigation and then just burying the report. We actually need to understand what the audit or the investigation said and what we need to do about it in terms of the next step. Fraud case. Some cases which can go on for a particular long period of time, we ask that there needs to be regular update to the fraud control section, and we ask that this be at least monthly. So where there is an update, that needs to be passed through to the fraud control section. Even if that update can be just advice that there hasn't been any progress in the current month, but we need to see that there is evidence that someone's keeping track of that, and that those cases are being managed proactively. And then the next few dot points relate to the elements of zero tolerance, as we've said. So reporting to police or other authorities, follow up once within the 6 months of initial report, recovery of any fraud losses, misappropriated funds or assets through whatever means, and a key aspect from our perspective is ensuring that preventative controls have been strengthened or beefed up, so the similar type of fraud doesn't occur again. So if we've met all those elements, as I said, we can then request the delegate to close the case, and if the delegate agrees, that matter can be. So that's the journey that we've taken this morning. In terms of our learning outcomes, in terms of identifying fraud, we looked at the definition of fraud, and we said that the key elements to note with the definition, which was dishonestly obtaining a benefit or causing a loss through deception or other means, was that it involved the element of intent, and it also was a very, very broad definition capturing many, many things. We also looked at the fraud triangle, which was the conceptual model of how fraud arises. We have pressures operating on the individual of some nature. We have a process of rationalisation, and then the opportunity, if it presents itself through weak controls, can allow fraud to occur. We also looked at some of the red flags in terms of things to raise our suspicion or to be on the lookout for. These on their own don't prove fraud has occurred, but certainly they merit further scrutiny. Then we look at some of the common frauds we see, and then some of the specific categories. We looked at bribery, foreign officials, facilitation, payments, and conflicts. We said with bribery that it has extraterritorial application, and there's a process for reporting that. You can report that through the fraud control section. We can relay that to the appropriate people internally in DFAT and make sure it makes its way to the Australian Federal Police. With facilitation payments, we said that DFAT's policy is that we don't enter into facilitation payments, and we certainly don't. Aid funds cannot be used to make facilitation payments. It's been ruled out from a policy perspective. Finally, with conflicts, we said we need to manage those as instructed, so we can't self-manage. That was all those issues were in relation to identifying fraud. Where we have identified fraud, then in terms of responsibilities, we said that we need to report that promptly, and that means within 5 working days to the fraud control section. We do have a what to report form, which will guide you through the information that we require, but we understand that initially at least it might be the case that you'll report by email, or you may not necessarily have all those details. That's perfectly fine. We can accept whatever you have to get the ball rolling, but we'll need details to. And also the importance of confidentiality and the privacy, both of the person making the allegation and the person against whom the allegation is made. Strictly needs to be a need-to-know basis. Just report to your immediate supervisor or your immediate manager in the case. And then with those matters, we dealt with them. The department deals with all those fraud matters under what we refer to as our zero tolerance approach. So this is a principle that we seek to apply in all cases, but no two fraud cases will ever be the same. So how that's applied to each particular set of circumstances and facts may be different, but the principle is always the same. So firstly, we undertake an investigation to confirm that fraud has occurred. And if it has occurred, then we seek to apply the appropriate administrative or contractual penalties, and we said normally that means termination. We also seek the prosecution of offenders where they're identified, including by reporting to local or police authorities, and we ask that there be one follow-up within the first 6 months of initial reporting. Again, the policy recognises that there may be grounds for exemption, and if you believe that's the case, if there are grounds for exemption, you can make that case to the delegate, and they may be in a position to grant exemption if they agree with the strength of the case. Zero tolerance also means that we seek recovery in all cases through whatever means we can. But again, the policy recognises that that may not be possible to recover in all cases, and where that's the case, approval for non-recovery can be sought through the appropriate financial delegate, and those requests can be passed through. The importance of proactive and timely case management. As I said, the longer things are left to continue on, the less likely it is that we'll have a good outcome in terms of the fraud management of that fraud case. So that's our learning journey this morning. I'm happy to take questions now, or indeed we can take a few, if questions occur to you later, you can report. We're happy to have conversations with you, and you can contact us at the DFAT Fraud and Control section at fraud@dfat.gov.au. So thank you. Happy to take any questions if you care to send them through.